That's wonderful to hear. That's
Yeah.
wonderful to hear. I'm still new, but I'm getting more and more of a sense of the wonderful Christian community
Yeah.
that is here, and I think that's one of the amazing strengths about this place.
Yeah.
That uh, I think most people out there don't have any clue
Hmm.
about the warmth and goodness of this Christian community.
I
You
agree.
know, we live in a time where and society where there's either a lot of fatherlessness
Hmm.
or abusive dads
Yeah.
or absentee dads or neglectful
Yeah.
dads. It's one thing to sire biologically kids. It's another thing to care for them,
Absolutely.
to disciple them,
Hmm.
to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and to be good citizens, what have you.
Hmm.
Um, Apparently, the biggest single commonality of those in prison is either
Hmm.
not having a dad around or having a really bad dad.
Yeah.
And other correlations, sociologists apparently have said the single biggest correlating factor in how much education a kid gets is the occupation of the dad.
Hmm.
And yet, and so there's that major issue. Some people would look at you with 9 kids and say, "How did you do it with your wife?" And then now, how are you doing it without your wife?
Yeah.
And talk about the fathering. I mean, in
Yeah.
a sense, it's a way to reflect the ultimate father,
It
isn't
is.
it?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's one of the. Well, I said earlier, it's the greatest privilege of my life, other than being a servant of Christ, was being a husband to my wife, and then a father to the children that God gave us. And that's absolutely true. And while Heather was so sick, and I was trying to care for her and help her, something that she had not been used to, that I would do that. I remember telling her, it's my privilege. That's what we get to do. We get to do these things for each other. And then I think it's the same for your children. It's a privilege to be their father, and to lay down my life for them. Right? We often think, we'd like to think if we were called upon to be martyred or something like that, we would lay down our life for Christ. Right? We would give our life for Christ, and God does call some people for that to be their story. Right? But a lot of us, God calls us to lay down our lives a little bit all the time for the things He's given us to do, right? He calls us to die daily for the things He's given us to do. And the way we do that is by laying down our lives for others. And so it's a privilege for me to get to be a father to my kids and serve them that way. And that doesn't mean I've done it perfectly. I assure you, I pray virtually every day that God would cover my mistakes. Right. I want to cover up the mistakes I've made, and because I've already done enough to condemn them to hell, I'm sure, if it were up to me to somehow save them. Right. Um, but, I realize with that too, even talking about that, there's a lot of people who've not had good experience. I had a very loving father. I had a good experience with my father. It was never hard for me to see God as a father, a loving father. There's a lot of people who've not had that experience, and that can make it really hard for them. So I know even when we talk about this, there's people that can be hurt by that because they don't see God that way, or it's hard for them to see God that way. But the answer for all those things is still Christ. Christ helps us overcome that. But Christ has helped me. He helped Heather and I when we could work together parenting, and He's helped me since then. It looks different. It looks different, of course. There's differences tend to be in the way men and women go about doing things and thinking about things. I think there's a difference between a mother and a father in a lot of things. So that's a challenge to think that to make sure that I'm at least thinking through how a woman's influence would be important. And in that regard, our church has been wonderful. My family has been extremely helpful in providing some of that. But it really is just, and I think it looks different in different phases of life, regardless. But it really just has been an effort to cling to Christ and then I think be open with my children and talk with them about it, which we've done. We talk about these things very openly of how it's going to look differently, how we've got to work together, how there's more wagon for all of us to pull, so to speak. And I'm thankful that God has blessed me with great kids who love Him and love me and have wanted to work through that together. And we still are. We still are. But
well, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. I think about the paradoxes of the Christian walk.
Yeah.
Like, what does this mean to die in order to live? What does this mean to lose your life so that you may gain it? And yet Jesus would talk about those things.
Yeah.
And when you think about like dying to your sinful nature and being dead to your spiritual nature, to your sinful nature, so that His life in us could live more fully, and to pour out our lives day by day, even unto death, if necessary, and time-wise. I think it was Ruth Bell Graham who once said, God gave her the martyrdom of a long life.
Yeah.
And she was often watching the kids while her husband was off all around the world, and I think Billy Graham once said of his wife that she was the best Christian that he ever knew.
Right.
And so it seems like there's this remarkable paradox. And I think what's great, as you're alluding to as well, we have the ultimate Father, and so He can redeem even when we do mess up. He is the Redeemer.
Yep.
And He is the perfect Father.
Absolutely.
But it's a tall calling, isn't it, for husbands to, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Absolutely. There's no standard higher than that.
Right.
To be a reflection of the Heavenly Father to your children.
Yeah.
These are callings that you can't put them in higher terms, I don't think, in terms of what ordinary dads and husbands are called to, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the type of work we do, if you do professional work, there's a lot of that sitting at a computer, right, in front of a keyboard. And I work in the office and also work at home. In a professional setting, that's often true, right? So I'm often reminded my kids will come in, and it's different when they age, right? What they need and things like that. But some of my younger kids will pass through, and it's you may think, oh, I'm working on this right now, and there's a time to say I can't be interrupted right now. I've got to focus on this, but other times, many times, right, we can be interrupted on things. And I can remember Heather actually telling me once, in terms of figuring out how do you work at home efficiently and how does that go, and I think there's sort of a beautiful picture in this. The way she said it was, a lot of times if you can just give them your face for a minute. And if we think about how often God talks about His face and His face shining on us, and that type of thing, if you can just give them your face. And that advice, that was years ago that she told me that. And that advice has been so helpful to me over the years. When they come in, maybe I do need to say, let Daddy finish typing this email, and then I can give you my face. And just turn and look at them and let them look at you, And when they're young, sometimes it's that, and it just takes a minute, and they've got something they want to tell me, or maybe they just want to climb up my lap a minute, and before you know it, they're down and off again. As kids get older, children get older, I don't think they don't pass through as frequently like that. My little kids still, if I'm at home, will often come by every morning. As soon as they get up, they'll pass through my office. But our older children the same way. They a lot of times need our face. They just need us to look and know that we care and we're trying. We don't always have the answer, and the older I think you kids get, the less you always have the answer. But they just need your face the same way we need our Heavenly Father's face to shine on us. And it's one of the things I've tried to learn to do that. I think even with students sometimes, they come in, I want to try to give them my face. They come in, they've got a question or something. Let me put this aside and look and give you my attention, so that you've got my face. And I'm listening, I care about you, and we can sort of deal with whatever it is from there.
It makes me think of the book of Job. After
Yeah.
Job pretty much lost everything,
Mm-hmm.
he lost his kids, his wife abandoned him, he lost his health,
Yeah.
he lost his reputation apparently, because even his closest friends thought this was punishment for what he had done. He had questions of
Yep.
the Lord, and they're asked very candidly in the scriptures. But then it's almost as if God doesn't answer all his questions,
Correct.
but then he gives him himself, and he appears, and gives Job his face in a sense.
Yep.
And in the midst of that was like enough and more than enough for Job.
Yeah.
And he's able to say, even before that happens, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him.
Correct.
Though he try me, I will come forth as gold.
Right.
When he has tried me, I'll come forth as gold, and things along those lines. That may be what you're talking about, largely writ,
Mm-hmm.
and how we might be able to maybe imitate that
Yeah.
in our small ways as earthly dads.
Yeah. And when you say that about Job, it reminds me of, I believe it was C.S. Lewis who said, he who has Christ and anything else has nothing more than he who has Christ alone. And Phil Vischer's got a book called Me, Myself, and Bob that the concluding parts of that book's got some really great stuff.
The maker
in
of
it.
VeggieTales.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
And
The maker of
Bob
VeggieTales.
Bob the tomato being the
correct. Exactly right.
character from there.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
And in that, he's reflecting on that idea, and I won't get the quote exactly right, but he says something to the effect of, he who has Christ and a big house, or he who has Christ and a fancy new car, has nothing more than he who has Christ alone. And he says, that's easy for me. But then he says, but what about he who has Christ and a good marriage? Has nothing more than he who has Christ alone. So do you really believe that Christ is that way, that he's everything, that he's infinite, that nothing can be added to him? And God likes to tell stories with ironies in them and things. I think years and years ago, before Heather passed away, I'd spoken in another convocation at law school, and in that convocation I'd spoken about suffering, and I'd spoken specifically about why we look around sometimes and it seems like the wicked prosper. So I'd use the Psalms where Asaph and David both are talking about that.
Like Psalm 73, for example.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And so, and Asaph, when he goes to God's house and he remembers then he sees the end of the wicked and that type of thing. And so I talked about suffering like that and how you get through suffering. And I quoted from that. And then, how could I possibly know that God would call me to live that exactly out, where I would have to answer the question, do I really believe that he who's got Christ plus a loving marriage would you would still have just as much as you had before, if that loving marriage was taken away. So it's ironic, how God turns his story that way, and but good. There was sort of the foundation laid for things there that you don't even know. Maybe it's like God had given me the plane ticket, but not quite the boarding pass yet. And I got the boarding pass when I was ready for it. But I had a friend of mine at church tell me as well, after Heather passed away, talking about Job. Obviously, when you think of suffering, this book of Job will come to mind. But he said, have you ever noticed that in the Bible, when in the end, God has given Job back double, right? So he gets double the sheep, double the donkeys. When he gets to the children, he doesn't get double. He gets the same number. And, you might wonder why that is. And he said, I think there's a comfort in that to look and say, it's because those were things that Job hadn't really lost. His children weren't gone. It was just that maybe the separation came quicker than they thought. And when it's going to be a little longer than they thought, at least in terms of this life. And it's the same with Heather and I. My wife isn't gone. It's just the time of separation before we've got a cemetery that we made out on the farm, and so I've got a headstone out there. She's buried there. My spot's marked out already. It's got my name and the start date. I'm just missing the end date, right? I don't have the final date on there. So that period is going to be longer than we thought. But I haven't lost her. She's not gone.
I think the poet John Donne put it this way, that this life is merely the cover of the book.
Yeah.
And when you put it next to eternity.
Absolutely.
You think in mathematics how anything divided by infinity equals 0.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
And so the brevity of this life.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to a point that you made earlier, somebody who's a follower of Christ who helps to manage Stanford University's massive endowment,
mm-hmm.
he says everything good in life is like a big 0.
Mm-hmm.
And you can add all the zeros together. But then when you put Christ into the mix, then he's the significant digit in front of the zeros
yeah.
that make it
mm-hmm.
mean something, as opposed to being what, in Ecclesiastes talks about vanity, meaninglessness,
Absolutely.
emptiness. And if you don't have the one who makes sense of it all,
mm-hmm.
because he knows it all. Not that we necessarily have a full grasp on things, but that he does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate it. It's a great quote. And I think that sheds some light on what I mean when I say when I was an atheist, I don't know how I would have gone through. When I was an atheist, I tried to be consistent with what I believed. And if you really believe that, there can't be any ultimate meaning to anything. We're just a glob of molecules, and this is what we do under these conditions. And you may feel like you feel love, but that's just what matter does in the composition you're in right now and the way it's reacting together. So there can't be any ultimate meaning in anything. We just have to make the best proximate meaning that we can. And maybe proximate meaning is okay in certain settings, but when you stand by a grave of somebody you love, and maybe you're putting a shovel of dirt on there, I don't know how much proximate meaning helps in that. But when you're going through, you get news, the cancer diagnosis, when you face that type of thing, there is a huge amount of comfort to know that there is real purpose in all of this, even if we don't know exactly what it is, even if we don't fully understand it, but to know and trust that none of this is meaningless, that, to paraphrase the psalm, that God's got all those tears in a bottle, right? He's not missed any of that. He's written all the days of my life in the pages of his book before I ever lived one of them. Those are comforting thoughts.
Indeed. I think this is where existentialist philosophy really misses it.
Yeah.
And where they even maybe turn this hopelessness, meaninglessness into a virtue in the sense that they are like the heroic,
correct.
anti-hero
Yep.
who is, facing this dark reality of meaninglessness and doesn't go to what they would deem the false comfort of this God who either isn't there or isn't good or something. And they almost turn it into this sort of anti-heroic, sort of fist in the face of God sort of thing.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is, no, there's actually a real deal here. And there actually is a good God who can bring good out of evil, who can bring meaning and purpose in life. Yeah,
you see me smiling and laughing about that because that just reminds me of exactly the way I would talk when I was an atheist. So that's why, it sort of rings with me there enough. I was gonna be heroic and sort of stand on the edge of the abyss and be willing to look out into it. I don't need this. I'm not gonna require a crutch. I'm gonna be truthful about the way the world is. And the Lord was so good to me, because when I was sitting blaspheming God like that, Jesus was keeping my heart beating, because we're told in Colossians that all of reality is held together by Christ. So the reason that I don't snap out of existence right this minute or that minute is because of Christ. But yeah, I really, I felt that way. But God was so good to me in so many different areas in my life to lead me out of that. One was actually the testimony of my wife. I was raised in a Christian home, and she was not. And so I tended, I'd been to Sunday school. My parents had taken me to church and Sunday school and vacation Bible school. I knew the Bible stories, that type of thing. And Heather really hadn't done those things and didn't know the Bible like that. And I can remember a lot of the people I talked to and that I was in college with, even if they were, not living holy lives at all, if they found out you were an atheist, that was really shocking to them. I was growing up in the South in Eastern Kentucky, and they would try to talk me out of it, and I would talk to people. I would say, don't. I'm just going to hurt your faith. If you can believe it, go for it. Don't talk to me about this. But Heather and I worked at the theater together, and she was a manager and I was a projectionist. So we would often be late at night together, waiting on the last movie to end. Nobody's there, and it's just us. And we'd see a lot of time to talk. And I remember she would listen to all my great arguments for why God couldn't exist, and she would say, "Yeah, I don't know the answer to that." She wouldn't get mad. That's what a lot of people would do. They get mad, and that would sort of make you think, see, it's threatening them. They don't really believe it, and when it threatens them, they get afraid, and so they get mad. And she wouldn't get mad, but she would just say, I don't know the answer to that, but I still believe. I still believe there's a God. And then another huge event for me was when we found out we were expecting our first child. So we thought we'd wait till I got out of law school to have kids, and we didn't really do any other planning to make that come into fruition. So I had 2 kids born in law school. Sierra, my oldest, it was when Heather was pregnant with her, and we'd had a car accident. So we had an ultrasound very early on. And this is years ago, so the ultrasounds weren't as good as they are now. But still, Sierra would basically, about fit in your hand. She's just this tiny little person. And the contour, the curvature of her face, the profile looks the same as it does right now. It was astounding to see this little person. And I'd always had a very libertarian view. So it came out of my atheism, flowed out of my atheism, because I thought, hey, all this is meaningless anyway. So you only get one trip around on this thing. So everybody ought to be able to do whatever they want to do to try to make themselves happy. You sort of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. So I'd been pro-choice because of that, very pro-choice. And I'd already started to move on these things. I was probably more of an agnostic by then, because I thought, it's pretty arrogant to think I can know the whole universe well enough to know there can't be a God anywhere.
In terms of proving a negative.
Yeah. That was a pretty arrogant position.
Yeah.
So I'd sort of backed off of that to say, well, really, I just don't know. And maybe if there is a God, certainly we can't know him, anything like that. But to see this so obviously a little person, and to see her moving her hands, and like babies do in the womb, they're moving their mouth, they're chewing, they're doing the things that babies do. They're just doing it in utero, and that was a huge event for me as well, a really life-changing event. I'd love to say at that moment I repented and saved me. It was after that. I'm not exactly sure the moment when God regenerated me. But I know after that, found myself for the first time in my life reading the Bible to actually see, understand who God is, and to know him more, and to want to know what he expects of me, and how he would expect me to live, and how I could please him. So I would say really to have a relationship with him, not just so maybe I could raise my hand in Sunday school and say, yeah, I read my Bible this week, or because there might be a quiz that I would answer questions to, but really to understand God and what he expects of me and what he wants in his world. So that was after I was a first year law student that summer. Then into that, I started going arriving to law school early to read my Bible before classes started. And then eventually that led to me being here at Liberty University, where I would feel like what God has called me to is to really try to understand issues of law and policy from a biblical worldview. So to understand, what does God expect in the realm of justice and law and policy, and to really how to work that out in the American legal system, and to try to provide answers and perspective to what often seem like intractable problems in our time.